Hello and welcome to AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to the world of African aviation with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. Today, I'm joined by somebody who is no stranger to the AviaDev podcast or the AviaDev stage. I've introduced Sean Mendis to the audience many times over the years. He is somebody who wears many hats, literally in this particular case. Sean is an aviation consultant and industry expert who brings a vast amount of real-time African aviation experience to the table. The reason that we're speaking today is that yesterday I became aware of a post that Sean did about the 10th anniversary of Africa World Airlines, a domestic and regional airline based in Ghana. The airline turned 10 on the 21st of September 2022, and Sean was there right at the beginning and then came back for a second stint later on. And it is one of African aviation's biggest success stories. So today's an opportunity for the audience to hear about Sean's journey with the airline. And as with all great stories and all great business stories, there is the initial excitement and optimism of a startup. Then, of course, there's the obstacles, the anxiety, the stress. And I am pleased to say, though, that the story has a happy ending, so do stay tuned. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can also see some images that Sean's been very kind to share with us, documenting the journey as we go. For those listening, we'll do our best to kind of explain what's going on in those images and tell you the stories around those, but you can always the AviaDev YouTube channel and grab. So welcome back to the podcast, Sean.
Thanks very much for having me, John.
So let's start at the beginning. Where did it all begin, and where were you? What were you doing, and how did this whole idea sort of come to pass?
You know, like many great things in the world, it was a combination of the right people in the right place at the right time. And prior to Africa World Airlines, so from 2005 to 2010, I was with Ghana International Airlines, the former national airline in Ghana. And I was part of the management team there. But over the last few years of Ghana International Airlines' existence, there were a number of challenges in terms of the government support for the airline and the direction of the business model and so forth. And one of the members of our board of directors at that time was Apiji Afeno, whose day job was as an investment banker with SAS Ghana. He formerly was with United Airlines. He had a background in aviation as well as being an investment banker. And SAS Ghana, Strategic African Securities, was owned by Thogbe Afede. Now, Thogbe Afede is a really unique individual. He's, everyone who meets him definitely comes away really impressed by him. He is, among other things, the Agbomefe of Asogui, which is basically the paramount chief of the Volta region in Ghana. But he's not just a traditional leader. He's a Yale MBA. He's an investment banker, which on an investment bank he set up himself, and he's a self-made multimillionaire. So he basically had the resources as well as the acumen and the connections to be able to drive a project like this. So in the middle of 2010, probably around July or August of 2010, the president of Ghana at the time, President Mills, had gone on an official visit to China. And Thogbe had been part of the delegation of businessmen accompanying him. And while he was in China, he had meetings with China Africa Development Fund as well as HNA Group, who were interested in exploring opportunities in the aviation sector, among other sectors in Africa. So Thogbe came back, spoke to Apiji. Apiji was like, let me talk to Sean. And so I met up with Apiji middle of September, so probably around the 20th or so of September in 2010. And we had lunch at Alisa Hotel in Northridge in Accra, where Apiji just laid out, Thogbe's got potential Chinese investors interested in an aviation project. And, do you think there's an opportunity for an airline in Ghana? And, of course, we both knew that the answer to that was definitely yes. The national airline had just shut down a few months ago. Even with the national airline operating, there had been a lack of good domestic connectivity. There'd been, poor and expensive regional connectivity. So we're both confident that there was an option. And, I remember there was the paper napkins on the table, and I took one out and I was taking notes on the back of it, and HNA Group. And then I wrote Embraer 145 ? And I keep teasing Embraer about that over the years, that, I used to have 3 question marks. You've been able to remove 1 or 2 of those. You need to start removing the 3rd. But Embraer, yesterday, Chico from Embraer messaged me and said it was was 3 question marks and now down to 0. So 10 years down the line, maybe he's right. But yeah, so, we were like, all right, there is an opportunity here. So we got together and we started drafting just a general outline of potential business case. Then in October of 2010, the 3 of us, together with Mr. Selby from the Ministry of Transport at the time, took a trip to China. And over there, we met with this is Adam Tan from HNA Group and Hainan Airlines. We met with China Africa Development Fund, and generally it was a very positive reception to our business case. We put forward an idea that an airline based upon regional aircraft, and at the time we weren't fixed on an Embraer 145. We were looking at potentially turboprops, at regional jets, so Embraer, ERJ, and so forth. But one thing which came out of the meeting over there was HNA mentioning that they had a surplus of Embraer 145s that were being manufactured by Embraer at the Embraer facility in Harbin in China. And their subsidiary Tianjin Airlines was taking delivery of these, on an ongoing basis. And, that was a potential contribution that HNA had to a project like this. So, the pieces began coming together. We got the green light. So we came back to Ghana end of October and set about, the process of actually setting up an airline. So we went to register the company. And a little bit of trivia here for people who are interested. The first choice of name for the airline was not actually Africa World Airlines. It was Trans-Africa Airways. But when APIGI went to the Register of Companies to register that name, we found that somebody else had a very similar name already registered. So the backup plan was Africa World Airlines, and so that was what it was. In fact, for quite a number of years, till about 2014 or 15, the website domain www.flytransafrica.com also redirected to Africa World Airlines' website. So we had Fly Africa World, we had Fly Transafrica, and we had a couple of other names as well that I can't recall that all pointed to that. So that was in November. We submitted our application to Ghana Civil Aviation Authority, and then in December we had a voir dire with them about the just the general business plan and so forth. In January 2011, the HNA team came to Ghana in mass. We met with them, and that's at Togbei's house. We had like 3 days of intensive meetings with them around Togbei's dining table. And we began putting together our team as well from our side, our technical team. So I was employee number 1. Employee number 2 was Moses, who's still actually there with the airline. And he's cycled through, I think, probably 5 or 6 different roles over the last 10 years. We began getting our pilots together. Ivan, who's now the director of flight ops there, was the first pilot to commit to us. And back then he was the first officer. Now he's a TRI instructing young pilots on the Embraer. And the things began coming together as we awaited the adjudication of our license. We eventually got our license on, I think it was the first week of March in 2011. And that was it was a pretty big celebration for us, because at that point, we went from being a paper concept to being something that would achieve something. Now, certainly the ACL, as I like to say, is it's a license on paper, but it's not even like a visa to travel to a country. It's the appointment for the visa to begin the process of application to travel. So it was the first step on a long journey, but it was a step that allowed us to actually, begin putting the solid pieces in together. And it was a very important step for us that time. So immediately after
I just wanted to jump in, Sean, because, I think what I wanted to understand, and I think you've outlined this quite nicely, but what I wanted to understand early on is that the partnership with HNA, the partnership with Hainan, what was it from a business perspective that they wanted, and how long-term did they see it? Because a lot of the learnings that we want to deliver through the podcast for those people who want to start up and they're looking for a partner, be that an investment partner, strategic partner. Obviously, you've explained why it fitted together with the ERJs, etc. Was this a profit-making center for them? Was there a strategic reason that they wanted to build something in Africa? How did they communicate it to yourselves, and what was their role in that partnership?
Well, you've got to go back a bit to China in 2010, where Chinese companies were basically flush with resources and had global ambitions. And HNA Group had always been one of the more nimble private sector, ostensibly private sector. It's partly owned by the Hainan state government, but they've always been one of the more nimble ones. So they were very keen on acquiring businesses and setting up businesses outside of China to complement those they had within China. And Africa was, well, due to a quirk of fate, Hainan Airlines had been allocated a number of routes to Africa by the Chinese authorities. So they'd looked at business opportunities in Africa. At the same time they were dealing with us, they were working on another project in Kenya, which I also helped them out a bit, but that one was unable to move forward due to some issues with the with regulatory issues on the Kenya side with foreign investments and so forth. And so they were keen to do that, but critically from a investment perspective was China Africa Development Fund. And China Africa Development Fund is a Chinese government sovereign wealth fund, effectively, which is administered by China Development Bank. And their goal is to basically invest in African infrastructure projects, on behalf of the Chinese government. And CAD Fund had actually been working with Togbay on a separate project, which was the Sanon Asogli power plant in Ghana. So they had a pre-existing relationship with Togbay, and they trusted him and they knew he had the right acumen and insight into this. So they were very keen to get on board with an airline investment as well. Infrastructure was one of their core business objectives. So they were very keen to find a project in Africa with the appropriate Chinese links that they could invest in. HNA was looking to invest in Africa. And, as I said, this was a case of the right place at the right time. The environment was such that HNA was keen to invest in Africa. We had a concept that worked well. And between Togbay and CAD Fund, there were the existing ties that brought government backing, that brought Togbay's influence and, backing to the table. And obviously the money, which CAD Fund brought in terms of cash equity investment, as opposed to, an idea doesn't go very far, and unfortunately in Ghana there simply isn't enough domestic capital to be able to fund an airline to the extent of what we needed. And I was just going through the old business plans, and I believe our first business plan wrote about $25 to $26 million in terms of requirements. Now that's both cash and the aircraft and the training and so forth, but there simply wasn't $25 to $26 million available domestically in Ghana to be able to fund this without going into huge amounts of debt. And one thing which AWA was adamant about at the beginning, and is still adamant today, is you cannot run an airline in Africa on the basis of debt. Your cash flow will wind up being affected. The rates of debt in Africa, for the most part, are usurious. And that's what really kills most airlines. So it was very key for us to be able to get a solid equity investor on board if the project was going to be successful. And between HNA and China Africa Development Fund, we had two absolute blue chips at the time.
And how did you talked about the business plan, obviously the name changed because you realized there was another entity that was registered, but how much did that change? Or was that key that you stuck to what you'd come up with on that first day with the napkin? Or is it key that you actually were flexible depending on what was available and you were a bit more, again, like I'm saying, we need some learnings that we can deliver to people who are looking at doing this. I think one of the things that's come out of this, which we always hear about when it comes to financing, is you need money to be able to you need some sort of investment up front. Looking at exchanging and bringing on a lot of debt is going to be very hard to service in the market. So how did the business plan change?
It's really interesting on that front as well, because as I said, I was reading through the old business plan, and our first draft of the business plan, I think you saw a slide of that there. And we look at today's route network, and it's pretty much identical. The concept we had at the time was to become a dominant regional player, domestic and regional player in Ghana, with a hub and spoke model centered on Accra. I mean, I've said those words so many times over the years, it rolls off the tongue well, but that is true today. The markets where we saw the opportunity and where we felt that the opportunity would be over the decade following 2010, pretty much everything has turned out the way that it was intended to. Our fleet choice at the time was, a 50-seater regional jet. But one area where the business plan has, I wouldn't say changed, because that still remains part of AWA's business plan, at least the last time I checked, was a second fleet type with a larger gauge. So something in the 100-seater, give or take, range over there. Because as markets reach a certain critical mass, you have to be able to reduce your unit costs of providing the service. Where AWA learned, and this is lessons which come further down the line, was something which surprised all of us, was that we didn't think that in Africa, we surveyed a lot of potential passengers and so forth to look at what their priorities were. We did not think that in Africa you could get a yield premium by offering higher frequencies. We felt that African passengers were more price sensitive, but that wasn't the case. And this is where AWA was able, when in a competitive environment, by offering 8 to 9, 10 flights a day on some routes, was able to get 15, 20, 30% higher yields from passengers simply by offering more frequencies. And that was when we doubled down on the 50-seater regional jets. And this is again lessons in 2018, 2019, when the fleet went up to 8 regional jets. And the reason for that was 50-seaters allow you to offer more frequency. We were doing at the peak 10 times a day to Kumasi, 6 times a day to Lagos, all this immediately pre-pandemic. So, there was a little bit of a tweak over there because there was something that was working. So we doubled down on it. And obviously that, in retrospect, was a good thing because we didn't wind up with expensive, larger planes during a pandemic where, we wouldn't have been able to fill them. But obviously, the business case for larger aircraft with lower unit cost still remains. And that was something we built into our original business plan, but has been deferred, obviously, by 10 years. First by Ebola in 2015 or so, when it was first supposed to have been happening. Then by the pandemic again, the COVID pandemic in 2020. And, I think the time may be right now for them to make that step.
Yeah, never a dull moment. But yeah, exactly what you're saying. You can increase the utilization partly because you can speed up and reduce the turnaround times of the smaller aircraft, and you can provide that flexibility to the passengers. And that's something that is always lamented in Africa, is that with the utilization is very low. That can be driven either by the operational business model or also by the limitations of the airports that don't have the required requirements, so you can fly overnight, etc. But it's about sweating the asset. You've always talked about that, and that the ERJ does a good job for that. So the one thing that I saw with the business plan, the reason I'm so interested is you and I see a lot of business plans. You see a lot more than me, and you actually understand them a bit better than me. But I'm always struck by, and I'm always worried when these things start with, oh, we're going to fly this long sector, we're going to have this larger aircraft type. There are certain markets which could stand that. The Nigerian market potentially could stand that because of the volume of people. But I was always like, no, you've got to have that realistic, and what AviaDev's all about is connecting those domestic and those regional markets with high frequency, and then you can start to build on that. Once you've got that capacity, you can then look to expand. ASKY is another one. Yes, it's 737s, but they're only serving the region. They haven't been tempted, and they obviously have the partnership with Ethiopian to provide that international connectivity, but they haven't decided to go and get a 777 and fly to Paris themselves. So, this is a big learning for Africa, I'm guessing, is just be realistic and don't feel like success means that you have to have a giant jet parked
half empty wide bodies to London, Paris, and Dubai.
Yes, to quote somebody that I've heard say that before. Yes, absolutely. So take us back then. You were obviously talking to us through the process with the ATL, etc. So, and I'll come back to the PowerPoint, but yeah, pick that up where you left off.
Yeah, so I think, I left it off right where we got our air carrier license, which was in March of 2011. So immediately after that, we had to start working on the technical certifications. So we went off to China. So myself, Ivan, and Phil Rushton, who was our engineering consultant at the time, we set off that is the receipt of the air carrier license in March of 2011. That's receiving it from Air Commodore Kwame Mumphy, who was the Director General of Ghana Civil Aviation at the time, and it was a really big support to us during the setup and certification phases. So yeah, so we went up to China in March of 2011. Myself, Ivan Narte, who's, as I said, now our first pilot, and now the head of flight operations, Phil Rushton, who was our engineering consultant. And we did a tour of all of HNA's facilities, pretty much. We were in Haikou, Sanya, Xi'an, Beijing, Tianjin. I mean, cities in China I hadn't heard of at the time, but which had really good facilities for training, for maintenance, for the actual aircraft themselves, which were on the ground there. So we spent about 2 weeks, jumping around different parts of China. But we came away with a very good idea in terms of what kind of technical support, what kind of asset support HNA could provide to us. And, that allowed us to fine tune our expectations in terms of, as we headed into the technical certification, of what we would need to develop ourselves locally and what we could rely on our partners at HNA to be able to do that. So, and HNA had really good facilities. They had Embraer 145 simulators. They had training centers for engineers where they were able to do Embraer type rating. And of course, if you look back at that picture, for those who looked at it, my Chinese airport pass for Tianjin Airport, one I had many of during the years. And I still don't know what most of that says, but people assure me it doesn't say, "This guy is dodgy, put him in jail." But yeah, so yeah, we spent a lot of time in China back then. That's Ivan, myself, and Phil. And I think what also was interesting back then was that it began to give me, at least, an understanding of how the Chinese do business, because it's very, very different than doing business in the West or, in Africa. A lot of business in China is conducted with personal relationships. You've got to know the person and earn their trust. You may have a really good idea, but unless the person trusts you, they're going to be very wary. And they're never going to tell you that to your face. They're going to, it's the subtle, the body language, the unwillingness to commit necessarily. When a Chinese person says, "Yes, let's do it," they will move heaven and earth to make that happen. When they say, "That's a good idea, let's have a look at how it is," they probably like the idea, but they're not quite sure they trust you, but possibly. There's something missing on it. You'll never get negatives from them. It's all about saving face and so forth. But, I began to learn at that time how business is done with China. And I think that's something that, definitely in other aspects has served me well, but it's something that AWA has learned and has helped AWA, doing international business, simply because AWA's management teams come from such a wide variety of background, with Chinese educated, Western educated, African educated. It's a very wide mix of things. And so the different perspectives in AWA, which helps evaluate various possible scenarios rather than having tunnel vision, which a lot of airlines come into, where either one person is driving the show, or where everybody has a similar background and therefore doesn't think outside the box as much. So I think that's a big reason for why AWA was able to do things. And of course, there was a lot of conflict as a result of it, but the end result, I think, was positive.
Yeah, and during this process, and you alluded to it, and you showed us the image, obviously, when you got the air carrier license as well, you had a lot of facilitation and support from the government, which again is something that we see sometimes private airlines in an environment where a government suddenly comes to power saying, "Hey, we're going to bring a national carrier back," and this, that, and the other. So obviously there'd been Ghana International, you were involved in that. At this time that you were setting up, it was pretty much clear, was it, that the government of Ghana was saying, "No, look, we're going to do everything we can to support this startup"? They weren't necessarily putting in investment, but they were facilitating. And was the conversation at that point, there wasn't talk of a national carrier, or has that always been the case? Because even today, now in September 2022, there's always talking in different countries, but especially Ghana, since the 10 years I've worked in African aviation, about we're starting a national airline. Like, how important was it that those conversations, or that wasn't happening? Or was it happening?
There was always talk of a national airline, and there was talk in the background. But, I'll give Governor of Ghana credit for this. For all their talk about a national airline, they have never said, and they've never, through their actions, had that national airline to be taking precedence over private sector. They have always encouraged private sector airlines to come in and set up and reach the level they can. Unfortunately, indirectly, that has an impact, because it's very hard to attract investment without clarity of government policy, the political risk aspect of it. We were very lucky in Ghana, again, that we were able to attract the National Pension Fund, SNIT, Social Security and National Investment Trust, to invest in Africa World Airlines. So we, till today, SNIT remains a 10% shareholder, and it's purely a financial investment. They have a seat on the board, but they're not actively involved in the day-to-day running. But I think that was something that SNIT saw as a potentially good investment for them. This is something that meets their mandate of investing in Ghana for the benefit of Ghanaians, as well as having solid financial future. I think that also helped bring a lot of comfort to China Africa Development Fund, and to HNA, that certainly that government is not a direct investor, but the government is not likely to torpedo a project in which the National Pension Fund is a small minority financial investor. But it was something that was important to the Chinese side, for sure, to reassure them. And as I mentioned, in the Kenya project, a big reason why that fell apart was that the Kenyan partners on that were unable to bring the similar level of government comfort to the Chinese that that allowed them to go forward with the investment. So yeah, it was important. But Ghana has, whatever Ghana says and what Ghana does tend to be sometimes different. And Ghana has, in my experience, and dealing with them for close to 20 years now, has always been open to private investors, even if they are in competition with the government.
No, great. And I think that, yeah, obviously at that time and still now, in a country like Kenya, there's a national airline that's always going to be that conflict that didn't exist at the time, and it can muddy the waters a little bit. So take us back. We're just in that ramp up phase to obviously getting operations launched. So take us back to where you were at that point.
Well, yeah. So we put our formal application in for the AOC after we returned from China. One of the interesting things we did in China actually was we stocked up for our offices with our prior to getting the air carrier license, we were operating out of Tokbei's conference room. So anything we needed to do, we sat in the conference room. So when we went to China, we went and bought piles and piles of computers and printers and all the little electronic gadgets for cheap in Guangzhou to lug back with us like typical African traders to Ghana. So we began taking a concept and making it into reality. We had access to some offices. Again, Togbei had some offices in cantonments where we set up in April of 2011. And our first visitors at that office actually was Airbus, who came, and as I joked, they tried to sell us an A380. In reality, it was just a courtesy call. But the Airbus team actually was led by another friend of AviaDev, Kwame Bekoe, who was with Airbus at the time. So that was when I first actually met Kwame, was when he came to visit us as part of Airbus's team. And as you can see, those who can see the picture, this was our first dedicated office for ourselves, which was next to Flair Catering in Cantonments in Accra. And we spent about a year there almost, from I think April of 2011 till March of 2012, we were in these offices. And genuinely, there's a lot of memories in the 2 and 3 rooms we shared there around our big tables, which were put together, and the number of presentations and things we did there were well, anyone who's been part of a startup will see the history in this, the commonality. I've done a lot of startups in different parts of the world, and the common thing is, you start working off boxes and camping chairs, and then when you look at where you eventually get 2 years later, it's good to look back at the roots and see the humble beginnings where things came from.
But just on that point though, Sean, as a business, and somebody myself as well who runs a business, there's a lot to be said for that, in terms of, you do see, and it always worries me, somebody starts something up and the first thing they do is, right, we need to go and buy a load of new office furniture, get a big lease, get a big sign up on the wall. And you say, well, that capital, that money should be spent on the operation. And there's a lot to be said. And it's great fun to be in that startup environment where you think, do you know what, we haven't got a lot, but we're going to make it work as best we can. I think from a psychological mentality perspective, it can really help the business. Do you agree?
Well, absolutely. And, I had a reputation of being an absolute cheapskate. I mean, I wanted
some might say you still do. Some might say.
Well, I take that as a compliment. If you can get something for $1, why spend $2 to do it? So, you may have $2 in your pocket. Well, just spend $1 and keep $1 for a rainy day. And, I think in the airline business, too many people don't do that. Airlines tend to peg their cost structure to the apex of revenue rather than the nadir of revenue. And as a result, you see many airlines struggle when a pandemic hits or something else, as opposed to airlines like AWA, which have a miserly cost control culture from day one. And as a result, AWA had a cash cushion, had the ability to survive, not just survive the pandemic, but come out of the pandemic thriving. AWA is doing better now after the pandemic, just in terms of pure numbers than it was before. Certainly margins are down because of fuel prices and, everything else. But in terms of passengers being transported, more passengers are going to be transported this year than in 2019. And, that says a lot about the resilience of a business that was built on a culture of count every penny and, don't waste it. And I think a big reason for that also, again, was Tokbe, because while they were waiting for the Chinese investors to come in, Tokbe was bankrolling all of this himself. I mean, in the first couple $1 million of startup costs and training costs and everything else, flying to China back and forth, everything was bankrolled by Tokbe. And he had a commitment to this vision. He had a commitment to the team, which, often goes unrecognized. Everyone's like, he's the big man sitting behind it. He may have been the big man sitting behind it, but I promise you, Tokbe is the kind of guy who sweats the details. And many a person has written a report for him with the typo on page 16, which will be the first thing he picks up on when he opens that report. He's got an eye for picking up the one wrong thing in 100 pages and saying, why did you get that wrong?
Yeah, again, it's that whole thing with the business of having some skin in the game, because you and I, again, we see these business plans that are created by somebody, and in the business plan is a whacking great salary for them, when actually, but the money's going to come from somebody else. So it's a case of, okay, so, you're going to get your salary. It's an idea, but where's your skin in the game? Whereas obviously he had that, and he was very close to the process. Am I right? I mean, that's what I see quite often with these.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, it was interesting, and I'll go back to this, a bit of a sore subject as well with some people. One of the things we did in our startup phase was our employment contracts with our team. They were basically all with not necessarily bonuses, but basically you will be on this salary until we get our AOC, and you will get this salary after we get it. In fact, my contract had a provision that I would either stay on as chief operations officer, or I could take a buyout with a 1-year bonus when we got our AOC. And, in the end, I wound up exercising the buyout and the bonus. But, everyone had that thing that it was definitely performance-based. You'll survive until we get the AOC, but your payoff will come once everybody gets, once the project is successful. Nobody, and there was a lot of people who made a lot of sacrifice in that initial stage. Some left jobs, and I was never one who was keen to convince people leave a job and come to a startup. But if you really believe in the startup, I will be the first one to welcome you in. And some people left jobs with established other airlines, with established companies, because they believed in the vision. And those are the folks who actually are still there today. Of our first 10 employees, 6 or 7 are still there today. And I think, that's the consistency of vision and the belief in the project that's so important. So, there's Ivan was there, Kwesi's there, Moses is there, Christabel's there. 2 of our first 10 employees, Nick and Ben Seishi, retired, so they would still be there, I presume, if they weren't getting up in the years, unfortunately. But, so many people were there for so long. It's just a handful of people in that first 10 to 15 who've left, including me, who left and came back and had employee number 1, and then had employee number 300 and something the second time round.
Yeah, I think that continuity, we talk about this as well, about, obviously an organization like Ethiopian that has a succession plan, has continuity, that has people who are actually tied to the vision of the airline, because it's got such clarity of what it exists as opposed to it being this kind of revolving door of different people that come through, that we see as well. With any system, with any business, with any sports team, generally where you have continuity over time, you'll have success, or because you have stability. So at this stage, you're a kind of a year into this, and I believe you go back to China to get everything kind of ramped up and ready for.
Yeah, we made a lot of trips to China. I mean, I think for about 7-8 trips over time. So, you know, as we started getting into the technicalities, we had to get the regulatory approvals for, you know, the training centers in China to inspect the aircraft, to inspect the maintenance centers. So I took another delegation off to China. I think it's probably around October of 2011, where we visited. Now that aircraft, those are looking at the picture, that aircraft behind me became the future 9 Golf Alpha Echo Tango. Tango was our first aircraft in Ghana, and this is her, well, before we adopted her from China, as we like to say. We adopted a Chinese orphan and we made it Ghanaian, and that's Tango, who's still flying for AWA and doing a yeoman job. So that was the first time I met Tango in a very smoggy day in Tianjin back in October 2011, together with Ghana Civil Aviation Authority. And so we did that, and you know, it was a big challenge. One of our big challenges back then was getting the certification for our foreign partners, because obviously Ghana Civil Aviation Authority had to do that, but a lot of the paperwork in China was in Chinese. And the translation and being able to broker that, I mean, it was stressful, a lot of work. We were lucky that, you know, we didn't have any doubts that HNA had the technical capability, and nor did Ghana Civil Aviation Authority. So it wasn't a case of prove yourself, but just getting all the paperwork in place took us all the way through, I think, probably from about April of 2011 till November of 2011 to get the approvals for the training centers, for the simulators, for all the services that were being provided to us by our shareholder HNA. In fact, they weren't quite the shareholder yet, by our partners at the time. The actual shareholders agreement and things were only signed closer to the launch in 2012. So there'll be future trips to China where we wind up having to sign those agreements.
And then you came back to Ghana and you got a different set of offices. Yeah, you were sort of progressing.
We were outgrowing our 3 little rooms at Flair Catering as more and more people came on board. So we were lucky at the end of 2011, the former Angola embassy premises were coming vacant. So we, you know, Togbe knew someone and we grabbed them. So that was the offices that we launched operations for, and actually remained in those offices to some extent, I think all the way till 2015 or 16. So yeah, there's a lot of the AWA story was written in the rooms over there. So yeah, we took the lease on that, I think, starting in January, and we moved into them first week. We moved into them on the, I think it was first week of March, definitely, of 2012, we moved into them, because we moved into them on Christabel's birthday, and I know her birthday is first week of March. So
and then you started training
we started our training for the first batch of pilots. We had 4 Ghanaian captains who signed on, and that's our first 4 Ghanaian captains. Kwesi Forson on the extreme left, who's now one of our trainers. Ivan, who is our head of flight operations and who was our first pilot. Kwesi, who was back then the chief pilot and was now the chief operations officer. And on the right was our director of safety, Seth, at the time, who then left us in, I think, 2016 or thereabouts. So those were our first 4 Ghanaian captains, and they started their training together with some first officers as well. They did the computer-based, the ground school training in Ghana, and then went off to Sanya in Hainan province, China, to do their simulator training, to finish their type rating at the HNA training center in Sanya. So our first 2 batches of pilots, actually, I think, went through their type ratings in Sanya. So yeah, that was an interesting time, again, after we got all those approvals from HNA.
So you've been working with HNA for quite some time at this point, you know, in a formal and structured, but not an official capacity. It was only February 2012 that you actually went over and got everything signed and officially done. So that's a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort before something is signed to say, hey, we are now doing a joint venture.
And Togbe deserves the credit for that, because he was the one who kept, you know, funding everything, and he had the confidence based on his dealings with China African Development Fund in the past, and, you know, in general with the HNA team, that this was something that would happen. So he kept putting money into it. And as I said, there is no story without Togbeh's contribution to this. He was the one who really drove this project. And while we may have put the technicalities in place and we may have the stories on the lessons to learn from the business plan, the lesson to learn from Togbeh is, if you have a vision and you have the resources to make it happen, keep plugging at it, and it'll come to fruition. And he's done that not just with this airline, but with a number of other projects in Ghana as well, and which is why he's so respected in Ghana. So yeah, this is again another picture of the Ghana side and the China side over some negotiations. The other, I know that conference room in the HNA building in Beijing very, very well.
Yeah, I bet, absolutely. And then cabin crew coming on. So
yep.
Pilots done. So this is your first batch of cabin crew.
That is the first batch of cabin crew. One of the conditions that Ghana Civil Aviation Authority put on us is that our first batch of cabin crew needed to all have experience, a minimum of 1 year experience. So we've got a bunch of them there. A lot of them, some came from the other domestic airlines in Ghana, Amtrak. Some came from Ghana International Airlines. Some from the former Ghana Airways. Some from a couple of those in that picture are ex-Emirates. So yeah, there were a bunch of, it was a great team. And of that group over there, I think more than half of them are again still with AWA. But what I really love to see is out of that group, a lot of them are still with AWA, but a lot of them have actually moved on to other roles within the company. And you look at Olivia over there, who was cabin crew to start with, and she's now the service quality manager. You see Wendy, who is one of our, the quality audit manager in the quality department. You look at Josephine, who we brought in as the head of cabin crew at the time, and now she's been through ground handling, security. So it was just such a good team, and everyone had the vision, not just of this is my job from 9 to 5. They had interest, they had input into what the rest of the airline was doing, and that's paid off because they've been able to develop their careers to move on. I won't say bigger and better things, but move on to different things as they lost the interest in getting on a plane for 6 extras to Kumasi every morning.
And I do think that's a huge opportunity for airlines, and some airlines do it very well, to sell to people, look, you're part of something bigger here. You're connecting your country to the world. You have a higher purpose. You're bringing in tourism, economic development. You're providing cultural connections. And if you sell that, that's not a difficult concept to grasp, but too often people think, oh, I'm doing the job and I sign out. There's a real opportunity, especially with the homegrown carrier, to instill that pride of, no, I'm working for a higher purpose,
Absolutely. And that's two things which I always stress in recruitment was number one, you are going to, especially for cabin crew and frontline staff, is you are ambassadors of Ghana. A person who may be just transiting or, at a destination you fly to or whatever else may not actually have experience of Ghana. They may have watched the football team and the only Ghanaian they may have met is you. How you project yourself, how you conduct yourself reflects not only on you, not only on the company, but on the country. You are effectively roving ambassadors. And it was, none of our first team of cabin crew did not understand that well, and they've been superb ambassadors through the years. Every single one of them, I do not have a bad thing to say about any of them. They really set the tone and the culture for the front line of the organization with their enthusiasm and their actions. And the second thing out of it was, I stressed that by being at home, and it was good because we had some who had worked for Emirates, who'd been away, done the glamorous lifestyle, but then chose to come back home because they had kids, they had family, they had things like that, where they wanted to be at home. And the key to that was, this is not just a job, it's a career. This is something where you can be part on the ground floor of building something big. And I saw a picture of just 2 days ago where that first batch of people, of the whole team there who have been there since the beginning, got their 10-year long service awards. And I look back at all those people from that 10 years, and I can see that every single one of them really contributed to building the company up to where it is. So, they made a leap of faith at the time, and we were just fortunate that we had so many good people making a leap of faith at the time, and that's what helped build it up at quality, not just building something up that could fall apart, but built it up in quality. And what I'd like to also point out was built it up where the good things became institutionalized rather than individualized. It wasn't a situation where this person is leaving, so, oh my God, we've lost this expertise. And I point to myself. People said, how could you leave AWA right after the pandemic? And I'm like, the fact that I'm comfortable leaving AWA right after the pandemic is actually the biggest compliment to me I could have, because it wasn't that Sean was doing this or whatever else. Sean was directing things, that's fine. But it was the actual team that was doing things. They knew what to do. They knew how to do it. They just needed a couple of nudges to push them in the right direction to do it. On the strategic level, that was where the value of people came in. But the execution on the ground was done by our team members and continues to be done by the team members day in and day out. It is an institutionalized culture, not an individualized culture.
Brilliant. So August 2012, we are now here for the first delivery. So it wasn't the first flight, but it was the first delivery of the first aircraft with delivery, etc.
Yep, that was Tango, who is the one, if you remember, the one that I had visited in Tianjin before. So there she is in her new home, where she has lived since. And yeah, that was in August. It was planning those delivery flights was a bit of a challenge, because they had to come from Tianjin all the way to Ghana. So it went from Tianjin, Changsha, Kunming, exported from they did the export paperwork in Kunming to Dhaka, I think Dhaka, Ahmedabad, Abu Dhabi, Djibouti, Entebbe, Bangui, Accra.
Wow.
Over 5 days. It was a challenge. And I mean, totally, there's been 8 deliveries from China since then. So we've gotten a little better on the routings. Now they go through Chiang Mai and they enjoy a day in Thailand and things like that nowadays, rather than Dhaka. Nothing against Dhaka for the Bangladeshi viewers, but I think a resort in Chiang Mai is slightly better than the 4 Points by Sheraton Dhaka downtown.
So the aircraft is delivered, and then obviously you've got the demo flights to get the AOC.
Yep, we did demo flights. We were lucky. Ghana Civil Aviation Authority agreed to count the ferries from China towards our demonstration flight hours. So there were Civil Aviation Authority inspectors, and they inspected the pilots and the maintenance and stuff like that on the route, the 5-day route from China. But of course, we had to do, proving runs within Ghana domestically as well. So we did that. We had to do a full run back and forth with full load of passengers. So we had a bunch of staff and ministry people and Civil Aviation Authority people filling up the cabin and just demonstrating that we could do our check-ins and stuff like that. So I think this picture is from one of the demonstration flights to Kumasi. And you can see in the background, Captain Tommy Fjell. Shout out to Tommy. He was one of the Norwegian instructors who came in to just do the line training and help us with the certification back in August, September of 2012. And in fact, he went and picked up both the aircraft in China. He had a Chinese visa, so we could send him off to China to go pick up the aircraft. So Tommy literally spent like back-to-back weeks flying from China to Ghana, got back on a plane, flew back to China, brought another plane, brought it back to Ghana, because our pilots had done their type rating but hadn't had the line experience. So Tommy was the line trainer who checked out all our pilots and certified them on their ferries back to Ghana.
And it was quick then, the process. Well, you'd obviously impressed on the demo flights, and it was very quick because obviously the anniversary is the 21st of September. So it was a quick process to then have the AOC issued.
The demo flights were just the formality, pretty much. It was a very, very, very long process to get the manuals, to get all the processes and things written. And I mean, most of 2012, there's very little glamorous photography of of people sitting over laptops and typing up manuals and the like. And I was very, very hands-on involved with that. One of the stories out there is when we submitted our first copy of the minimum equipment list, the MEL. It was in portrait format, and the Civil Aviation Authority said they wanted it in landscape. But the way we had done it, we couldn't really convert portrait to landscape without everything falling apart. So we had 1 week where we had to retype a 600-page MEL, literally retype it. And there was like me and 3 others got together, and we had like 150 pages each to do. And believe me, an MEL is a crazy thing to retype, but we got it done within a week. And I remember it was because we had an open plan office, so I would be there and I'd have headphones on, and I needed something that would focus me without distracting me. And I played episodes of Downton Abbey on repeat. So I just had Downton Abbey playing in my headphones, which really, for whatever reason, just got me focused. Something about those posh British accents just sort of soothe you and get you to focus on typing MELs. But till today, I can honestly say that not many people know the Embraer 145 minimum equipment list as well as I do, because I typed the whole damn thing out.
And not so many people know the Downton Abbey full episode, sort of full story as well as you either. So
I tell you, I may not know what's happening on screen, but I know the sounds.
So the picture we've got now is obviously the 10 years ago when everything
absolutely was 21st of September 2012. Well, everything had been planned for the 21st anyway. It was intended for the 21st because that is Nkrumah's birthday. And he was obviously the first president of Ghana and the father of Pan-Africanism. So we felt it would be, for an airline that intended to connect Africa, it would be appropriate that, obviously we knew it was going to happen around that time, but 21st was selected at that day for that reason. And so on the morning of the 21st, GCA had emailed us all the paperwork the previous day, and we had to print it. And there was a huge traffic jam on the way to the airport. And we finally we got there with like 5 minutes to spare. It was crazy. I remember actually that cars were jammed. So Razak had to actually bring papers and hand them to me over like a road divider while I was in a car, and we had to just rush them off to Civil Aviation Authority. But again, you see Air Commodore Mamfi handing over the AOC to our CEO, our first CEO, Zhang Jihua, who had come over from H&A Group, and he was our CEO at the launch. And so we got our AOC on 21st September 2012, and it was the culmination literally of 2 years of work. And that's with some of our initial cabin crew. And interestingly, all but one of them are still with the company, and the only one who's not with the company anymore just left 2 years ago. So, you got Gloria, you got Esther, you got Patience, you got Josephine, you got Wendy, and 4 out of those 5 are still with the company.
I think it speaks volumes that all of them, and it's just such a it gives it that kind of family environment. And it's not a huge airline, as you said. It's achieved a great deal, and it's grown over the years, but it's not a big airline, and that's part of its benefit. So we're really here to talk about the journey to launch and the anniversary. So that now we've covered most of that, but obviously you then left after launch, and then you came back. So just give us a brief you've kind of explained why did you leave and why did you come back. Tell us about that.
Why did I leave? It's complex. It's no single thing. As I mentioned earlier, I was lucky enough that my contract gave me the option of staying on or leaving. And I'll say this, for all the good sides of what the Chinese bring, there's also some negatives. And a key thing was part of the shareholder agreement said that, the majority, the Chinese shareholders could nominate the CEO, the CFO, and a few other core positions there. And the minority shareholder could nominate the chief operations officer. As we were coming the last few months towards launch, we wound up in a situation where the management team wound up being 5 Chinese guys and me sitting in a room together. They would have meetings in Chinese, and one would stay behind and tell me this is what we've decided. And yes, that was, it was point one was something that I was uncomfortable with, because, decisions would be taken where I'd be responsible for that I wasn't actually part of the discussion for. And I'd also, I think I'd reached a point where I wouldn't say I'd had enough of Ghana, but I'd been living in Ghana as an expat for 8 years by that point. And I felt it was probably time for something new. So it was an amicable parting. I got a party, I got a certificate, I got all sorts of good things, and we parted as friends. Yes, there was friction here and there on that front, but it largely moved on. And I stayed in touch with everybody through the years. As I said, this was the management team, the top 10, 15, the heads of department at the time were people that had been handpicked. I mean, these were, if they weren't personal friends at the time, they became personal friends over 2 years of this shared experience. So it's not like you can walk away and then never speak to them again. So we were in touch regularly over the next few years. And I was in touch with Togbe as well. at a bare minimum. In fact, I remember one year I even sent him on 21st September, AWA Day email saying, this is the one time a year you get to hear from me. And, so it was always there. And then in August of 2018, I got an email from Togbe basically like, what are you doing next week? Are you available to come to Ghana? And I'm like, sure, what's happening? He's like, there's a board meeting and I need you to just basically come and, meet with the board and discuss something. So I'm like, sure. So they sent me a ticket. I flew off to Ghana, met with the board. And, by 2018, AWA was in a very different position. AWA started turning profits 2 years after launch. There'd been changes. The Chinese side, the first management team from China, at the risk of sounding a bit politically incorrect, turned out to be completely inept. They replaced that with Michael, who came in as CEO and really, changed the Chinese approach to AWA. AWA back at the initial stages, I think HNA Group struggled to have the right expertise on the ground in Africa. They, of the first set of people that came, there was a rotating door of these, but some of these guys genuinely did not know what Africa was like. I mean, I remember one guy coming and saying, where can I buy lion spray? And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, the spray, like mosquito spray, which you spray on yourself to keep away mosquitoes, you spray to keep away lions. And his wife had made him promise that he would spray himself with lion spray every day while he was in Africa. And she had a can which he brought with him from China, but it was running out and he wanted to know where he could get some. So, as I said, that was the HNA in general. And I think this is true with a lot of Chinese companies. At the top level, they have brilliant people. These are well-educated visionaries. They understand global business and so forth. As you drop to middle management, there is a huge delta there. There are very few in middle management who have the knowledge, the background, the capability of stepping up. And so when we were doing the setup for the business plan, we were dealing with the chairman, with CEOs, with the top level vice presidents. When it came to actually sending people to Ghana to do things, they were picking promising middle managers who simply did not have the ability or the capability of stepping up. And that was a problem because they were taking decisions that simply made no sense because they did not understand. They were taking what their experiences were in China and trying to apply them cookie cutter way to Africa. Michael Chenglu, when he came in, I wasn't there when he came in, but I know this from working with Michael subsequently, as well as from what everyone has said. He had a very different approach. He'd been working for Hainan Airlines in the US, so he had a more rounded global mindset, and he listened. He looked and said, look, this is not working. Why? And he listened to what people tell him rather than saying, this is not working, let's do it twice. And that really turned AWA around to the point that profits were had basically after year 2. And continued being profitable. But by the time 2017, 2018 came around, AWA was in a monopoly. All the other airlines in Ghana, the domestic airlines, had exited the market for various reasons. And AWA was still profitable, but while it had grown to 6 aircraft, it had not scaled. Basically, what AWA was doing was what we had set up for 2 aircraft, let's double it for 4, let's triple it for 6, and so forth. There was, the overheads were off, the lease agreements needed to be looked at, the insurance needed to be looked at, the general strategy. Where do you go? Because we'd written a 5-year business plan and now we are 6 years into it. We'd achieved pretty much everything we wanted to other than the second aircraft type. We'd even opened routes. The routes that the second aircraft type should have been there to open, we opened with the Embraer 145 successfully. And so it was, where do we go from here? They had options on the table. And, I've said this before to you on podcasts, but yeah, there were 3 options. Do we take AWA and make it an Emirates of West Africa with wide bodies and so forth, which was option 1, which was pretty quickly disregarded. There was option 2, which was, do we get large narrow bodies like 737 MAX, A320 Neos, and try and serve wider Africa, Southern Europe, and so forth. And that was a real option because we had the ability and to raise the financing, get it done, and the access. But one of Togbe's philosophies was you don't take something that's making a profit, put it into loss just with the chance of getting profits on the other side. So he was, I wouldn't say opposed to it, but he was wary of that. And then the third option was we double down on the model that we know is working and continue to grow as a regional airline, but grow our global presence through partnerships. And that was basically what they brought me back to do, to be able to finalize, which of those 3 strategies. Everyone was leaning towards the third strategy anyway, so it was just I was there to
Rubber
say, yes,
stamp.
that is the right strategy, and to execute on it, which was to streamline it. And, as I said, we did a lot of things publicly at AWA during my 2.5 years there in the second term. We launched new routes, we signed a lot of interline partnerships. We took the image to a different level, I think. It took the image from being a small provincial little airline to being a small regional but global player, so to speak. The airline was a member of IATA from 2017, but had not been active with a lot of getting the image out there. We did a lot of that. But the real things that I'm really proud of behind the scenes was the stuff that people don't realize. The fact that we restructured our aircraft leases for savings of $34 million over 10 years. The fact that we got about 60 to 70% savings on our insurance rates by bringing more of that insurance into Ghana cedi denominated insurance policies. The fact that we increased our direct distribution, so cutting out travel agents, much to the chagrin of the travel agents, but we cut that out from, was barely, in single digits of that to, at one point in September of 2020, just before I left, we were at over 50% direct distribution. We renegotiated GDS agreements. We slashed the cost of distributing through Amadeus by 50 to 60%. This is not stuff that you see, that a passenger sees. The passenger is still flying on the same plane. It's just costing us, a significant amount less. You're still being insured the same as you were. It's just not costing us $1.1 million a year to do so. You're still buying the ticket. It just means that we're making the profit and not Amadeus.
Yeah,
and
I was really impressed, and always have been with the marketing, and you did things like Wow Wednesdays where you did sort of really cheap sale fares that people were getting super excited about and buzzing on the radio stations, and you create free marketing by doing these things. But it was quite unusual in that market. We've seen things like this. SAF Air do a lot of this in South Africa. But I wanted to pick up on something else that you said, which I think was slightly ahead of its time. And we covered this obviously at the time on the podcast, but we now talk and we think that COVID was something that got a lot of African airlines, a lot of airlines globally to go, look, we need to grow through partnerships. And what AWA was able to do is go to these partners and say, look, we've operated safely, efficiently, securely for all this time in this market. We can give you that access to those markets. And you were signing interlines with these very large airlines, and they were saying, yeah, we're happy for you to provide that connectivity and be part of our network and extend our network. And now we're seeing that as a real trend. That is the way to grow. That when I speak to a lot of the airlines, especially in Southern Africa, they're realizing the old adage of, you can't do it on your own. You've got to work with partners, but you've also got to have the humility as the, your big supporter, your big boss had, to say, we need to know where we're best placed. Don't just go hunting prestige and hunting profit on the chance. Double down on what we do well, but don't miss opportunities as well. So, that would be my sort of takeaway on that side from the interlining side. You guys were early for sure.
Well, it was a conscious decision as we looked at what we were strong at and what we had a USP of. And the USP we had was what I call the last mile delivery. We had the aircraft which were able to go in with global standards. As a IATA member carrier, partner in GDS is able to do interline e-ticketing, meeting IOSA standards and so forth. We had the ability to fly you into the Kumasis, into the Tamales, into the Monrovias and Freetowns, where Emirates cannot put a 777 and Qatar cannot fly, and South African Airways and Brussels Airlines and so many of our other partners could not put an aircraft in, but still wanted to have a presence. And, it was what we could do. It was what we could bring to the table. And I'll be honest, and I'll say this, I can say it today, since I no longer have to sign deals with these guys, but we had some very one-sided SPAs in our favor, the special prorate agreements, while, and it was the truth. And I had this actual discussion with the Brussels Airlines, their area manager, and he was like, oh, this is very expensive and so forth. And I'm like, I can partner with any European airline. If you're not coming, I'll talk to Pat Portugal, I'll talk to KLM, I'll talk to whatever. You don't have a choice if you want to access these markets. So if you want to access these markets, you take $70 to Kumasi as my share of your ticket. Or if you don't, someone else will. And we were lucky. We got some very one-sided SPAs as a result. We had a couple of SPAs There were a couple which we needed to make more than they needed to make. Like, for example, I'll tell you with Qatar. Qatar drives a hard bargain. They're not easy people to negotiate with. But at the time, they weren't flying to Accra. They were flying to Lagos. So we were feeding them in Lagos. And they had obviously other options, with the Nigerian carriers and things like that to be able to do that. So we didn't have as much leverage for the Qatar SPA. So they had some preferential rates and low RBDs there. But in general, AWA came out of a lot of these negotiations punching well above our weight. And I think, that's also why a lot of other airlines respect AWA. It's a small airline, and it will always be. It's never going to be an Emirates or Qatar or whatever else. But the people we dealt with in Emirates and Qatar respect what AWA did and what AWA continues to do.
And actually, there's a wider lesson here, which is obviously something we talked about. One of the sessions we did at AviaDev this year that Atto Girma moderated was all about growing through partnerships, but how to ensure they're equitable and how to ensure you're getting your fair share and you're being treated right. So it's one
Absolutely.
thing providing that last mile, but being paid so that you're getting a fare that is fair, that ultimately pays to cover your operation and offers you that extra benefit because they're not going to get it from somewhere else. But I guess my learning from that is what AWA's experience of that shows is that these airlines that are negotiating those deals, they should back themselves because they've created this infrastructure. They are the only way they're going to provide that last mile. That airline itself isn't going to be able to tap into those markets with the aircraft it's got. It's got to use the local partners. And you should be sitting there saying, instead of saying, what will you give us? You should be saying, for us to do this, this is the price that we need.
Exactly. And, unfortunately, and, it is the truth. Too many African airline commercial managers don't have the confidence to do that. They are
deferential.
They're not just deferential, but most African airline commercial teams are there as a job rather than a career. They're there because they're waiting for their application at Emirates or Qatar or wherever to be shortlisted, and they don't want to piss people off. And sometimes it may not be conscious, but in the background, that's it. They don't have their own templates. When it comes to an SPA template, they'll say, you send me a proposal. And I'll tell you, I should send this to Atto Girma.
Immediately, you're giving them the power. Yeah,
you're giving them the power to propose the first numbers. And Ethiopian, when they sent their first numbers to AWA, I laughed at it. And we sent it back. I think we doubled virtually everything and sent it right back to them. So, Girma wants to say things should be equitable. I think his first proposal should reflect that. But anyway,
let's have this chat for sure. Right. Well, we've been on for ages, so we're gonna wrap it up now. But before we go, the whole idea of doing this, and thank you so much for sharing your story. I think the people who've been, who are genuinely interested in African aviation, they look at AWA. We're always citing them as a success story, same as ET, that people do even more. But what I wanted to get from it was those people who are either they're trying to learn the airline business, they're trying to start something up, they just need to be aware of what's going on. And I think I'd like to give you that opportunity to kind of give us some words of wisdom that you'd share with those listeners that have this idea, because we need people with ideas who have ambition to create the airlines of the future. But, from all of the experience that you've got with AWA and all the other activities that you've done, speak to them directly. What would you tell them to open their eyes and be well aware of before they embark on the journey?
I think the key to this, and if I look at AWA today has the same vision that AWA had when we first wrote that business plan in 2010. That shows that the idea we had, the vision we had, and the way we went about executing it was consistent throughout. There were good times, there were times we questioned whether we were doing the right thing, but we stuck with it throughout all of that, and at the end that paid off. Don't make knee-jerk decisions. Don't follow trends necessarily. Set the trends. You mentioned things like, Wow Wednesdays and, some of the creative marketing we did. You remember the ones that worked. There were a number of initiatives we tried, which, like the weddings in the sky and things like that, which were rightly consigned to the dustbins in retrospect. And, don't be afraid to do that. Try something, use it in a low-risk environment. You may twig on the next big idea. but you have to understand how much everything costs and what the upside of everything will be. A lot of dreamers go into things with, oh, I want to be the next Emirates. That's great. When you wind up with a backer with billions and billions of dollars to back you, and the potential market, because remember, Emirates always had a market. The migrant worker market was millions of passengers a year, tailor-made. There are very few African countries which even move 1 million passengers, period, even today. So when you have those circumstances, you can do it. You want to be the next Ethiopian? Great. Take 40 years to build yourself up to where Ethiopian actually became a viable entity, and then come back. If someone says you want to start Ethiopian today, I'll say, great. Come back in 2055 and I'll show you Ethiopian again. But people don't have that time to be patient. Yep. AWA today is not a large airline, but it's a profitable airline. And it's an airline which still has a future. And the reason it had a future was because it stayed consistent, because it stayed focused on profitability, stayed focused on cost control, stayed focused on human development. And that's why the same people who started this airline in 2010 are still there today, driving it forward.
Yeah, and the most exciting thing, I think, is there are loads of niches and opportunities and areas within the African market that can be served with not the same model as AWA, but a model that fits the opportunity. So you talked about cookie cutters. Yeah, forget it. You've got to get in there. You've got to. It's not about Africanizing something. It's about making it locally viable. So that would be Absolutely. The same if you had a European airline, you wanted to go into Latin America. This isn't an African thing. This is a look at the local environment and where's the opportunity? You know, can you compete? Because you see that the only alternative to get from A to B is a 24-hour bus that costs X amount. Is there a way to offer a 1-hour sector for twice the price? Would people pay that? Would that, you know, these are the kind of opportunities when you don't have the alternative infrastructure there. So, you know, you must be bullish that there's loads of opportunities on the African continent for another story like an AWA that's different, but could be equally successful.
The opportunities in Africa are pretty much infinite. I genuinely believe that, you know, we've seen this everywhere in the world, that as countries enter lower middle income range, the first thing people spend on is consumer goods. The second thing they spend on is travel. Africa is poised for a boom in the low-cost sector once somebody is able to, as you say, localize the model, find where cost savings can be had relative to the competitors, whether the competitor is buses, whether, well, I wouldn't say cost savings, where a better value proposition can be provided versus the competitors, because you're not actually selling transport in Africa as a low-cost carrier or whatever. You are not selling transport, you're selling the time value of your money. And that's the key. Once Africans begin to value their time more, and it happens as incomes grow and people, you know, when you're making $1 an hour, you don't mind spending an hour on a bus. When you're making $100 an hour, you do mind spending an hour on a bus. And therefore you'll spend 50 of that $100 to fly on a plane instead. Yeah. And that's, you know, that's as more and more Africans get to the stage where they value their time more, there will be an absolute explosion across the continent. And this has happened already in markets like South Africa with SAFAir. As South African economy grew, SAFAir demand for that kind of model, SAFAir and Kulula, exploded. You are seeing that even in Ghana on a smaller scale, where despite the pandemic, Ghana in 2022 is going to set an all-time record for the number of domestic passengers transported. Domestic passengers in Ghana will cross 900,000 this year. Previous best was 735,000 back in 2014. So this is, we're not even talking small incremental growth. We're talking, I mean, a tripling of passenger numbers from 2020 to 2022. And that's incredible. It just shows that when there is a focus on safety, reliability, and affordability, and consumers have a confidence in their service providers like AWA and Passionair in Ghana are providing safe, reliable, and affordable transportation for the most part, consumers will flock to it. So I hope to see that. I hope to see a more successful story than AWA, because AWA made a lot of mistakes that people can learn from. And I hope someone who watches this or listens to this can learn some of the mistakes, the cultural issues, some of the wrong judgment we took at a certain point of time or whatever else. And, you know, contact me. I'm happy to talk to you. I'm happy to consult with you. But there is going to be another African success story sooner or later. And I think it'll come in the low-cost segment.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, we'll put a link, obviously, so that people can connect with you in the show notes. No problem at all. I'm so glad we ended on a positive note, although the whole thing's been great fun and really positive. And thank you for being so generous with your time, Sean. It's really, really kind of you.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody out there for being part of this slightly different podcast today. If you did enjoy it, please do share it with somebody in your network you think would benefit. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. We've got loads of more episodes coming out between now and Christmas, and we're not going anywhere. And we'll see you for that next episode very soon. Thank you all for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.